Okay, so today we're going to talk about the article titled "The Research Note on the Prevalence of Housing Evictions Among Children Born in U.S. Cities." Quite a title. This is an example of, and I like to include a couple of these. This is an example of something called demography. Demography. I always misspell things when I'm standing in front of the board. Okay. So demography. Demography is the study of populations. Anybody notice anything about this article that's different than all the other articles that we've looked at?
It's a quantitative article?
It is certainly a quantitative article, yes. We've looked at other quantitative articles. How is this one even more different from those? Because the one like last class was also a quantitative article. How's it different?
This one seems to be primarily big data. They're just always showing the tables through that article.
Yeah, a good chunk of this is not necessarily very readable, right? And part of the reason why I include this is going back to like the original, one of the original intentions in having articles is to have you guys look through things, right? That maybe are a little beyond what you can actually read, but still figure out how to try to like pull information out of them. Going back to like, there's some interesting, if you guys were going to write like a term paper on eviction, there's interesting stuff in here you could use, right? That, without even being able to read the math, right? And so it's good to kind of go through that exercise. So that's part of the reason. That, and I also just wanted to talk about evictions, because evictions is actually becoming a really big problem in the United States. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to explore. So anything people gleaned from the article before I start talking more? Anything people noticed or interesting things that they pulled out? I like pauses, don't worry. Yeah.
You know how they just said, like, in the beginning that approximately 1 in 4 children are predicted by the age of 15? Like, I think about it, that's kind of a lot of kids that have to go through that. And that's probably pretty traumatic to have, like, their home kind of ripped, like, underneath them. So, it was way more than I thought they were.
Yeah, and that's actually probably the primary point of this article is that evictions is far more common than we realize. And part of that is most evictions don't go through any formal channels. And we're going to actually kind of see, and I explain eviction, why that happens. So yeah, eviction is really quite common. What else did you notice? Yeah, go ahead.
So it seems like this research must have been just like extremely difficult to do. It's not only were you working with like most evictions were not reported, like they're all informal evictions, but also you're trying to track the same kids like throughout their entire childhood.
Yeah.
So I kind of appreciate like how much effort they have put into this.
Yeah, this is a good point. This is a very difficult study to do, and they have to do a lot of weird, and this is one of the reasons why there's so much math in here. So to some degree they're asking a question that takes a lot of mathematical finagling to actually come up with an answer for, right? Because they're actually combining different people to make their claim, right? Which is really hard to do mathematically. So like, even though like, and to be honest, like, I'm not a demographer, those people know math a lot better than I do. Sometimes I don't know what's going on. So it's perfectly okay if you feel a little uncomfortable with it. Anything else that people thought was interesting that they pulled out? Yeah.
I had a quote that I found was interesting. Because I think it's on 391. And it said that rising rents and savings over time raises collection
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Can you say it a little, read it aloud a little louder?
Sorry.
No problem.
Rising rents and stagnant or declining wages have contributed to increasingly unaffordable housing options for many U.S. households.
Yeah, so that's talking about the eviction crisis in the United States. A big part of it is that we have stagnating wages and rising housing costs, and have for a while now. So that means that a lot less people, like I read something, this was a while back, that the average person in the 1970s spent 10% of their income on housing. The average person now spends half. So you think about how much difference that is, right? It's a huge increase. So like more and more of our money goes, and this is true in general because there's also like rising food costs. More and more of our money just goes to bare essentials. Less and less of our money goes to other things. And that's even more true if you're talking about impoverished populations, right? And often they're stuck between different essentials that they can't actually afford, right? Increasingly so. Yeah, so that's pretty interesting data. Anyone else notice anything you want to pull out? I thought this quote on page 392 at the end of that first paragraph was really interesting. This talking about, so we were talking before about prisons, right? It makes a direct link to something we already talked about in class, right? Which is, to some degree for men, the incarceration system kind of becomes this continual perpetuation of their poverty, right? So, you know, African American males are more likely to go to prison than college, you know? And we talked about, like, you know, once you leave prison, like, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to come out and get a really real steady paying job. And it makes a direct connection with that, that predominantly people who are evicted are poor black women with children, right? And the same situation happens with them, right? So like to some degree, evictions, and we're going to see why you even make that claim, evictions set them off basically to perpetuate their social position over time, right? Like that they cannot actually get out of it. Okay. Pretty cool on all that? Okay, great. Let's talk about, so like part of the reason why like there is more and more stuff being published on eviction is, like I said, because it's rising. And understand why. To understand why, we have to back up and talk about something that we could call recent history, which is what happened in 2008. Is anybody familiar with something very major that happened in 2008?
Economic recession.
Yeah. Sometimes now it's called the Great Recession. Sometimes it's, does anyone know another name for it? So 2008. Now it's often called the Great Recession. Mainly because it's lasted so long. We're arguably still in it to this day, which is a long time, 12 years. If that's true, it makes it the single longest economic recession in world history. We have now surpassed the length of the Great Depression. It's not as bad as the Great Depression, but it's longer. And there's a lot of evidence that wages are still stagnating. So, yeah. At the time, they didn't call it that. They called it the housing market crisis, or the housing market crash, right? One or the other. That's what people referred to it as in 2008. I know most of you guys were only, what, 7? Right? Okay. This is the year I graduated from undergrad. What a great year to graduate from undergrad, right? And at the time, not to like, so many people flooded into grad school because like no one could get a job, right? Like it was impossible coming right out of school to get anything but like the same jobs you had to like make ends meet when you were in college. Anyways, does anybody know what caused the housing market crash? Is anyone familiar with this?
Was it like something to do with people buying too many, or like it was like booming and then it just crashed or something?
I didn't hear the last part. Sorry, I keep on doing that because like I'm right above below the fan when I'm up in front, so that's why I can't always hear people.
Wasn't it booming or something and then like something happened to cause it to crash?
Yeah. You were kind of, so there's something about people's buying homes. Maybe something particularly about mortgages. People know this? So it was caused by a glut in something called subprime mortgages. Which a lot of times at the time got framed as this sort of like people taking out bad loans. But there's a question of like, why is it that all of a sudden banks are offering a bunch of what are arguably really bad loans, right? No way anybody could pay it back ever, right? All of a sudden banks are offering a ton of these and people can't pay it back and it causes the stock market to crash. Not the banks do eventually have to get bailed out, but it's not originally the banks caused the stock market to crash. And I think these links don't really make sense until you understand how banking laws changed, or what people were doing with banking that was very different. Are you familiar with
My
this?
mom works in this field, so I heard a lot about it.
Oh, okay, cool. You should have jumped in when I asked. If you could explain
I don't
that.
know all the details, it's fairly complex, but yeah.
Yeah, and this is a simplified version, but so I'm not going to give it like the full-on complex end of it. Okay, cool. That's fun. Feel free to chime in whenever you want to. So yeah, why is it that banks are offering it? How does it affect the stock market? And to understand this, we have to understand something referred to as mortgage-backed securities. So, what's the stock market? What do you do in the stock market? Do people know this? If you do, jump in. If I'm asking stupid questions, just holler, yeah.
You invest money, you give people money to start up their businesses or whatever, and they will theoretically pay you back for your money.
Yeah. So, how do we often talk about years? They sell what of their companies? Shares, right? They sell shares of their company. You buy it back, right? So, what happens if you have a company which could be really great, but probably won't get off the ground? What would happen?
You take a loan.
So you could take a loan, right? But even like, if you want to make it publicly traded and you want people to buy those shares, what do you do? Do you know? Because like you don't want risky loans, right? Like you want loans that are going to pay you back money, right? For the most part. What you do is you get some other way of sort of like, if you will, sweetening the pot, right? So you add something in that's likely to go up, right? And you kind of like piggyback them together and sell them together. Does that make sense? Kind of bundle them together. So you sell your shares with something else. Okay. So the bank, this is before the banks are doing subprime mortgages. They're just doing regular old mortgages. And basically the bank has to make money off of its mortgages. But there's this thing called the futures market, which is not the stock market. So one question, has anybody ever heard of the futures market before? Is anybody here from a farming family? Do you have any farmers?
I apparently do. It's my middle name, Aaron.
Okay.
I'm a farmer from Kansas, apparently.
But no like immediate family that
No.
farms? If you know farmers, a lot of times farmers don't just sell their grain, but they'll like basically kind of like hedge their bets and say what price they think it's going to sell for, right? And then if it goes above that, they lose money, and if if it goes below that, they essentially make money that they wouldn't have otherwise. Are you guys aware of this? That's the futures market. So the futures market allows you to kind of like hedge your bets on things. It's traditionally only done for agriculture. The futures market isn't in New York City like the stock market, it's in Chicago. And it's almost always unilaterally just been used for agricultural products. Because like, you know, you could have a tornado wipe out your crop, you could whatever, right? So what you do is you sell your risk. So you sell the risk, and basically somebody goes along and they buy that risk as an investment. Right? So it works kind of like the stock market, but not, because essentially all you sell is the potential that things will go wrong. Right? They'll protect you if things go wrong, but if things go well, they'll make money. Make sense? Everyone follow that? So what happens is...
safer than...
What's that?
Is it technically safer than the stock market?
No, it's actually in some ways a little more risky, right? Because like you could just like completely get wiped out if grain prices dropped all of a sudden or something like that, right? So like actually like a lot of people who invested in the futures market for dairy got recently like really dumped because cheese prices like dropped to nothing. I don't know if you're aware of that. Like cheese is really cheap right now. It's not if you buy it in the stock in the grocery store, but it is if you buy it like in bulk. Anyways, getting back to the idea. So basically what happens in the 90s is that the banks say, well, why am I holding the risk on loans when I can just sell it? So essentially, banks take out loans, they make a certain amount of profit of it, and they sell the rest of it to the futures market. That's how it gets here, right? So people are backing their stocks with these bits of debt being sold off, basically. People selling off the risk of their mortgages. You guys following this? Does this make sense? I know this is a bit like technical businessy kind of stuff. So what happens is that all of a sudden in 2008, a bunch of people can't make their mortgages, which then basically causes that risk to turn into a bad investment, which has now been divvied up and sold off worldwide under line items that people didn't even know what they were buying. They just added it to their, essentially to their stock prices because it was always going up. Right? Make sense? And that tanked the entire economic, essentially tanked the entire stock market system, and we went into the recession that we're in. Following that? You're probably thinking, what the heck does this have to do with evictions? Well, it kind of works like this. Does anybody know what traditionally happens when housing prices go up? Or when housing prices go down to rent? When housing prices are low, rent is high. When rent is low, housing prices are high, right? They usually act inversely. Which means that in some ways there's always kind of like an affordable option. But what happened in 2008 is that, I'm not sitting enough today. I'm not reading in the article with you guys, so I'm not sitting as much as okay. So after 2008, the banking, essentially what happens is the banking system shifts to something else. The banking system shifts to rent. Or at least a lot more loans are now rent-backed rather than housing-backed. So the bank uses rent like it used mortgages before. Okay. So my question is this: why would that be beneficial? right? I think that's the next question. Why did they switch to backing things by rent?
Well, isn't it more like a tenancy?
A what?
A tenancy, like you're a tenant or something?
Still couldn't hear you, sorry.
Like, if it's rent back, then it's kind of like you're being, like, a tenant of the house. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that way it's safer than mortgage, or, wait, that's what it's called.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, it is safer. Why would it be safer? What happens if you don't pay rent? You get evicted. How easy is it to evict people? Really easy. It's very easy to evict people. How easy is it to get somebody out of a house that they're owning or that they're working on owning? It's a lot harder, right? So the idea is basically like there's less risk involved if you attach things to rent than if you attach it to housing. Is anybody familiar with what happens anybody here planning on owning an apartment at some point? Like maybe here in Atchison in a couple of years, move off campus. What's that?
Owning or renting?
Renting. People plan on renting houses, renting something in their life.
Well, there's also starter homes that are like for 2 people at least.
Yeah, there are starter homes. It's difficult. Why do people rent rather than get homes, usually? Yeah.
It's like less of a commitment and it can be less time.
So yeah, it's less of a commitment. So if you're gonna move away, it's probably not a good idea to buy something. What else?
If you're in a big city, unless you're $1 million on you, then it's really impossible to buy a house with a mortgage.
Yeah, so in some places it's just really expensive. What else? Did you do something else now?
Usually there's like utility issues that the landlord take care of that. You don't have to do with that.
So there are things that landlords are supposed to take care of, and you don't have to pay for that. I always actually kind of liked renting for that reason. I own a house now. I kind of hate owning a house because if something breaks, I have to figure out what to do. Hate that. And I'm not handy at all. But another reason is that it's just hard to get loans, right? It's hard to get loans to buy houses. You usually can't buy a house outright. It's difficult to buy a house. Okay. So, next thing we should probably talk about is, let's say hypothetically you guys rent a place. Get a nice house in Atchison. Tree falls on it. Big hole in the roof. You just got rain coming in. Call up your landlord. He says, and you say, there's a giant hole in my roof, the tree fell. Come and fix it. And he says, nah, I don't want to. What do you do?
I'd probably go to the lease agreement and report it to somebody.
Yeah, so you got a lease agreement, right? So what do you have to do to get him to owe up to what he owes you? Because technically he's supposed to fix that. And if it's a hole in the roof, it's not even livable, right? So the fact that you're in there should be just completely illegal if he's not going to fix it, right? So does anybody know where you go from here?
The city?
No, you don't go to the city. The city won't do anything for you. You lawyer up and you sue, right? Does anybody know where housing disagreements go? A place that's colloquially called rent court. It's called landlord-tenant court. This is the technical name, but everybody calls it rent court. Rent court has different rules than other court systems. As a general rule, rent court will almost always side with the landlord. It's very rare that they don't. That's just statistically speaking. But even if you sue them and win, you get placed on something called the tenant blacklist. So your tenant, there's a third party not associated with the court, and there's a few of them. They're companies that compile these blacklists. So your tenant will, if you sue your tenant, whether you win, whether you lose, whether it's a draw, whatever, will place you on a tenant blacklist for having taken them to court, which is perfectly legal. From now on, if you try to rent from anyone else, your name is red flagged. Because every time you rent something, they do a background check. And these companies report that you've been blacklisted as a bad tenant. They don't tell you why you're a bad tenant. If you would have burnt the house down, it would have been the same outcome. You would essentially become a blacklisted tenant. So they don't know why you're blacklisted.
But if
They
it's
just
something
know that
that's
you
not
are.
your fault, that's not really fair.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
That's ridiculous.
What's that?
That's ridiculous.
But yeah, it doesn't matter. It's a third party. There's no like regulation of that, right? Okay. So that's one thing we can do. What else can you do as a tenant? Tree, big hole in your roof. You don't want to sue your landlord because you know you're going to get blacklisted. Yeah, well, let's say like you can have up to 2-3 years leases in states. Like, let's say you just moved in a month ago. You're gonna live with a hole in your roof for 3 years?
Well, with the reverse card, blacklist your landlord.
But that doesn't. How would that affect your landlord? Do you have Better Business Bureau? Like, you can report people to the Better Business Bureau. Like, does anybody ever check that? Have you ever rented a place, bought a car, bought a sandwich, and checked with the Better Business Bureau before you did it, just to make sure that the company was on the up and up? No. So, like, in a lot of ways, you can do it. But the landlord probably won't be affected by it. What else?
I mean, if you really want to be that guy, you can fix the hole yourself and get rid of the tree.
Does anybody know a problem with that? It's a breach of contract. If you fix it yourself, you can be sued by your landlord for breach of contract, if he so desires. He can also blacklist you for breaking the contract. Even if you don't charge him for it, even if you just like fix it, and they're like, okay man, I fixed it, like, he might not do that, right? But he could. I think this is a fascinating sticky wicket. So, yeah.
Could you try and work out like an agreement for like that month, like to get like a discount on your rent, or like to go into a fixing of a hole in the roof, like some sort of like temporary agreement money-wise?
You could try to do that for sure, right? By the way, so let's say he doesn't fix it and you leave and he agrees to let you out of your lease. How much do you owe him? The entire 3 years worth of rent. Right? Okay, let's say you just walk away. Right? What do you think happens if you just walk away? He could sue you for the rent, for the lost rent, and you would also automatically be blacklisted as well. Right? So I'm going to venture a question that I started with. Why do you think banks would move towards rent-backed loans?
Because if you're a landlord and renting something for you, it's a pretty high chance that you're always going to make a good amount of income. So they'll be able to pay your loan back.
Yeah, so it's pretty much guaranteed. And in fact, you often and increasingly, people's landlords are actually just the bank. Or some third-party company that the bank works with. Right, so it's not like here I rented a house and I knew my landlord. His name is Craig Ostertag. Somebody, his wife works here at Benedictine. He's a nice guy. If things broke, I could just call him, right? So that's still a lot of people's situations, but increasingly in the United States, people are being placed inside of housing units, particularly large housing units that are owned by banking systems themselves, actual banking companies, right? First of all, disproportionately, what population do you think lives in these? I'll give you a clue, this is still inequality. Anyone want to venture a guess? This is an obvious guess, guys. Who lives in these apartments mostly?
Women with kids?
What's that?
Is it women with kids?
Oh, yeah, probably. Like, I mean, yeah, you have a lot of, you would have a lot of women and kids with it. What else? Well, who else? What specific subset? Lower income and minorities predominantly live in these units.
College students, like young college students, and people with proud college.
Yeah, so sometimes they are, right? But there's a danger too with college students, right? Because even though like you don't have much recourse, their parents are likely what? Pretty financially sound, right? And they usually have enough influence that they could hurt your reputation pretty well. There's a general rule in these, and so there are things like within these units that there's actually a policy that if people ask to get things fixed or repaired, they will just evict them rather than do it. Right? So if the sink goes, if the toilet goes, and they complain, or if they need something fixed and it's part of their rental agreement, their dishwasher goes, they'll just evict them rather than fix it, so that they don't have to have the cost of it. Right? It's pretty much guaranteed income, which is why they've switched to that law. Right? And so more and more of these are existing, more and more loans are being backed by this in the United States right now, which is actually one of the primary causes of this increasing eviction. So we have a combination of, okay, so getting back to that, I know I'm like circling my way back to stuff, but I said that as housing costs often go up, rent goes down and vice versa, right? So there's usually a back and forth. Does anybody know what's been happening with the price of houses since 2000? Anyone know? Anyone want to venture a guess? In 2008, what were houses after the market crash? What's that?
Were they cheap?
They were really cheap. They were ridiculously cheap. I'll give you a clue. Like the first home that I bought it for $40,000. I sold it 2 years later for $70,000. I sold it for $70,000, and then the adjuster person, I sold it to a friend for $70,000. And the adjuster person called me up and was like, "Why is your house selling for so little in this neighborhood?" Right, so that's essentially what happened is the price of houses increased, right? We're also in a housing shortage because at the same time, and this is completely incidental, the cost of materials increased, so they stopped building houses, right? So we have less houses than we did before, but at the same time, because of the rent-back system, the rent also increased along with the housing rate, all while wages stagnated, so they stayed constant, right? So this is why eviction is becoming a major problem in the United States. Make sense? Yeah. I don't know. Did you guys not think that's interesting? I think that's totally an interesting thing that's going on that nobody's talking about. It's pretty well documented too. So. Any thoughts or things people want to share, or questions people have about? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so hypothetically, what would be a smarter course of action to take? Would it be better to raise the income of people and keep the houses and renting going up, or bring the houses and renting going down while raising the income a little bit, or both are going down while it stays steady? Like, what would be?
I mean, it's hard. Okay, so you're going to notice that in sociology we often present a lot of problems. We're pretty slow to present solutions. And that's because solutions are a lot more difficult, one. And then two, like when we start talking about solutions, especially if we start talking about policy kind of solutions, we often fall into a trap of feeling like we engineer the society we live in, right? So like, before any of that, we'd have to ask, what the heck could we do to even lower housing costs or raise, right, rates? And like also like what's achievable within that, right? So like if you know, you don't just say like, well, let's raise wages, right? We don't necessarily have something that we can do that with as a mechanism. But what we do know is that under social stratification, like inequality will continue to rise unless we do something to alter it, right? A lot of the solutions to altering it are not things that people are okay with, it often involves like massive amounts of tax money being spent by the government, because if you can't just trust a third party to actually do things, they're going to be in the interest of people who have no power or recourse, right? And in a lot of ways, if we want to know why the housing, like why rent court looks the way it does, it looks the way it does because people have acted from the banking system, landlords over time, people who had enough money and influence to influence how policy works have altered the laws to make rent court a thing, right? So like when the rent court first started, that wouldn't have been true for it, right? But over time, there's actually a term for this. Has anybody ever heard the term rentierism? Rentierism is essentially when people use their wealth and power to guarantee that continued success within whatever they're doing, right? Which is technically not supposed to be like, so if you were to like, if you guys are into like free market stuff, right? And like Adam Smith complains a lot about rentierism, who's the founder of old school liberalism, right? It's a little different than neoliberalism. But anyways, the idea is that you need the government to break things up so that break up monopolies and so on and so forth so that rentierism doesn't happen. But the problem with rentierism is that often like it gets written into the laws of the country itself, right? So we now exist in very much so in a place where companies have been allowed to sort of like redo the structure of it. And I think the banking system is a great example of rentierism. In particular, sorry, not the banking system. I think the housing market is a great example of rentierism, right? And I know that's a little confusing to say because we're talking about rent in a different sense. But rentierism in this sense means basically like using your power so that other people can't, so you don't have to compete with other people, right? Other groups, other organizations, other companies. Okay, all that makes sense? Cool. Any other questions or thoughts people have about this?
Yeah, so the housing market in Hickey, Mississippi, where I'm from,
Yeah.
we're a 10,000 people town. So the housing market is really affordable there because people make a lot of money and then like the interest on loans is just really, really low.
Yeah.
No property tax. So is that not the case for like other small towns? Like when we talk about like how inaffordable housing is, are we just mainly talking about big cities because that's where most of the population is?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So like, I think we see a lot of this stuff happening in big cities, but it depends on the small town. So housing costs in some small town areas are really bad. And so like, if we are talking about like when you start adding like rural areas in, it gets really interesting. So in the 90s, you had a sudden boom in rural areas. So they became economically a lot more powerful than they were in the past, right? But then there's also in certain areas continued decline. So like you'll see like bad housing costs in places like Appalachia often, or Indian reservations often have unaffordable housing. Or so there's certain brands of rural small town life that are bad, and other areas that are not. So it depends, right? A lot of cities, not Atchison itself, I think Atchison's fairly affordable, but like a lot of these are something called a micropolis. It's like the smallest thing above rural. And smallest thing about a small town, a lot of places like this actually are some of the fastest increasing areas in terms of cost of housing worldwide. It's also one of the few places in America where wages are actually dropping rather than just staying stagnant. So, yeah. Any other questions? Did anyone hear about eviction stuff in COVID-19, by the way? Some people are, part of the relevance of this and why this has been popping up a lot is because people are really afraid that COVID-19 might throw us into another economic depression before we recovered from the last one. And part of the idea is that there's actually like this weird eviction crisis that we don't know what's going to happen with it. Does anybody hear this? Does anybody know what happened with people paying rent as a result of COVID-19? Because what happened, like a lot of people lost their jobs and stuff, right? Do we know what the government did? They did send stimulus, but once again, actually, like stimulus depended on how much money you made. So like, it didn't really reach a lot of the people who were threatened and stuff.
They did something along the lines, if I remember, like they basically protected those, putting a shield on them, saying like the landlords are not allowed to evict them. And I forget all the details, but I remember doing something online, so like the government basically protected them, and it's actually coming, like the deadline to when it's supposed to end is coming up. So people are starting to get really scared that like, if they don't get a job or start really paying up. Because apparently, like even though they haven't paid the rent, it's still been piling up for them.
Yeah.
So
no, that's exactly it. Yeah, and so like where most of the things that we owe, things like college debt, like just got a pause on it, and we just pick it back up, right? Rent, they did something different with, possibly because of this system. And what they had is essentially like you don't have to pay your landlord, but there's a due date, and then everything you added up is all of a sudden due. So like you think in a lot of cities, right, like, you know, you're talking about people paying, you know, $1,200 a month in rent, all of a sudden they're going to have $12,000 due, and they haven't been working. Right? And if all these loans are backed by rent, what is that going to mean? Right, is a question. Now I'm not saying that, like, I don't like to predict the future, so you're never going to hear me claim that that's what's going to happen with anything we talk about. Social scientists don't like predicting the future, but it's still kind of fascinating, so probably won't happen. If it does happen, you're going to be like, wow, Dr. Holland is a prophet. Okay, so that ends our discussion of our articles. We're going to talk about, I'm going to start talking on Friday about something called replication theory, and then we're also going to talk about the history of classes, social classes. Hopefully I can fit both that in. If I can't, I might cut one of them. Yeah. So
I'm still kind of confused on rentierism.
what's that?
I'm confused still on rentierism. Rentierism.
Oh, you wanted to know what rentierism was? Okay, yeah. So rentierism is when